You actually thought you were enough for me, David. Please. You're just a complete snooze fest.
She thought she'd broken him. She was wrong. He was just biding his time. Michael glanced up from his desk, startled. The sudden appearance of David in his doorway was like a jolt of electricity. David stood there, a dark cloud where his usual grin should have been. It wasn't just that he wasn't smiling. His entire demeanor was off. His eyes, always bright and full of it, were now flat and distant, like he was looking through you, not at you. The change was jarring, almost creepy. It was like the life had been sucked right out of him, replaced by a hollow shell. Michael's stomach did a weird flip. This was not the David he knew. "Michael, you got a minute tonight?" David's voice was low, almost a mumble, totally unlike his usual confident tone that usually bounced off the walls. It was barely a whisper, as if he was afraid someone might overhear him. This was so unlike Dave, whose voice usually filled the office with boisterous energy. Michael frowned, his brow knotting with concern. "Yeah, sure, Dave, what's up?" He tried to keep his voice casual, but his worry was a hard knot forming in his chest. "Something on your mind, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." He knew the question was blunt, but he wanted David to know he noticed. He could feel the tension hanging in the air, thick as a fog. This wasn't the same David who was always cracking jokes and slapping him on the back. This was something else, and it was making Michael uneasy. David's eyes darted around the office like he was checking for eavesdroppers, nervous as a cat. He looked left and right, like someone was watching. "It's personal. Something I need to talk through." His voice wavered slightly, a crack in his usually smooth facade. He even seemed to have trouble looking Michael directly in the eyes. It was unsettling. David never seemed nervous about anything. Michael had known him for years, and never seen him act this way. Michael hesitated, sensing the weight behind those words. This wasn't just some casual chat. He knew something big was coming. "Okay, how about that coffee joint near the office after work?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but the worry was there, plain as day. "The usual spot, about 5:30. We can grab a coffee or something." He hoped the suggestion offered some comfort to David, a familiar place for this unfamiliar situation. He desperately needed to figure out what was going on, but he also needed to tread carefully. David nodded slightly, his shoulders slumping like someone had just pulled the plug on him. Yeah, that'd work. He almost looked defeated, like he was carrying the weight of the world. He turned to leave, his steps slow and deliberate, like he was wading through mud. Michael watched him go, a pit of dread forming in his gut. As David walked away, Michael's unease settled deeper. Something was definitely off. Something seriously wrong. He felt the need to go after David and shake him, but held back, knowing it wouldn't help. David had been slipping, not all at once, but like a slow leak. It wasn't just the way he looked, it was the way he carried himself, almost like he was trying to disappear. The usual spark in his eyes was gone, replaced by this vacant, haunted look. The playful ribbing they'd always shared had gone silent, the friendly jabs and jokes, the constant office banter. It was like a switch had been flipped, and the old David was simply gone. Even at lunch, David sat across from him, staring into space, fork barely touching his plate. He'd become a shell of his former self, almost like he was going through the motions, not really present. Michael was worried sick. This was not the David he knew and loved. Michael had tried to pry, once, sitting next to him by the window, the city spread out below like a giant map. He'd hoped to find an opening, some way to show he was there. "Everything okay, Dave?" His voice was low, careful. "You seem distant lately, man. Anything I can do?" He wanted to help, but he knew he had to tread lightly, not wanting to push too hard. David had looked at him then, a flicker of pain in those dead eyes, before shaking his head. It's complicated. His voice was barely above a whisper, the words heavy with something unspoken. It was a single sentence, but it was so full of sadness and pain. He clearly wasn't okay, and Michael needed to figure out how to get through to him. Michael had pressed, but David just waved him off, refusing to spill. It's just some stuff," David said vaguely, his tone dismissive. "Don't worry about it." He was clearly trying to shut Michael down, but Michael wasn't going to let him. The tension between them hung there, unsaid but heavy, like a weight pressing down on the entire office. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with his friend and that now he felt responsible for helping David through whatever it was. He knew he wouldn't let David go through whatever it was alone, no matter what. Now, as the office emptied, the other people's voices and movement feeling like a distant echo, Michael found himself waiting anxiously for David to meet him at the coffee shop. The clock on the wall seemed to mock him, each tick feeling like an eternity. He checked his watch repeatedly, the minutes crawling by. David's words, his actions, were a knot in his stomach, a constant reminder of whatever his friend was going through. He just wanted to get David to open up. He knew that the coffee shop was just the first step, and that no matter what, he wouldn't let David go through whatever it was alone. The two men sat across from each other in the quiet coffee shop, the espresso machine hissing in the background. The air was thick, you could practically taste the tension. David stared at his hands, his fingers picking at the edge of the table like it was a loose thread, a nervous tick Michael had never seen before. He looked like he was about to crack. "What's up, Dave? You ain't been yourself lately." Michael's voice was low, careful, like he was walking on eggshells. He leaned forward, eyes locked on David, trying to show he was there for him. This was the moment. He had to get David to open up. David sighed, a deep, shuddering breath that sounded like it came from his boots. "My wife. She's been screwing around on me." The words hung in the air, raw and brutal, like a punch to the gut. Michael felt a wave of shock, but tried to keep his expression neutral. He needed to be there for David, not add to the chaos. Michael froze, his brain struggling to catch up. The pain in David's voice was a raw, open wound that bled into the silence around them. "Damn, Dave, I'm sorry. That's gotta hurt." He knew those words were inadequate, but it was all he could muster at the moment. David nodded, a single tear escaping and tracing its way down his cheek. "I don't know what to do anymore, man," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Feel like I'm drowning, and I can't even see the surface." His hands were shaking a little, like he was holding back a tidal wave. Michael reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on David's arm. "How did you find out?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady despite the storm inside him. He wanted all the details to help him put this puzzle together. David looked up, his eyes hollow, like there was nobody home. "It was when I was in New York, on that business trip," he began, his voice trembling. "I came back a day early. Got home, and there were these damn shoes by the door, shoes I'd never seen before." He paused, his voice shaking as he relived the moment. "I heard her laughing. From the living room. I couldn't stop myself. I walked in, and there she was, in the living room with some guy." David's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white as bone as the memories flashed in his mind. "It felt like some bad dream, man. I couldn't breathe. I turned around and went back to my room and shut the door." Michael could hear the raw pain, and he couldn't believe his friend was going through this. Michael listened, his heart aching for his friend. The pain in David's voice was a gaping wound that seemed to suck the air out of the room. So what happened after that? he asked softly, keeping his voice gentle. He was trying not to press, but he needed the whole story. David sighed, his shoulders slumping. Next morning, I confronted her, showed her the pictures, the whole shebang. She didn't try to deny it, just admitted everything. His voice was a rasp, barely hanging on. Says it's been going on for months. The bitterness in his voice was clear as day. The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of David's pain pressing down on them. Michael could feel the tension in the air, a thick, palpable thing that seemed to squeeze the very breath from his lungs. He had to let him know that he was there for him. "I don't think we can fix this, Mike," David whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm thinking about calling it quits, getting divorced." The words hung there, heavy as stones, like a final nail in the coffin. Michael nodded slowly, his grip tightening on David's arm. "I get it, man," he said softly. "And I'll back you no matter what you decide. But please, don't go through this alone. Anything you need, just name it, okay?" His voice was firm, like a promise that couldn't be broken. This was a promise, not just words. David looked up, a flicker of hope sparking in his eyes. "You serious, man?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You'd do that for me?" He needed that reassurance. "Damn right I am," Michael said firmly. "We're colleagues, yeah, but we're more than that, Dave. We're friends. We'll get through this together." His voice was solid, like a rock in the storm. He was in this with him, no matter what. David managed a small smile, the first genuine one Michael had seen in weeks. "Thanks, man," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He really meant it. Michael smiled back, his heart still aching for his friend. "You ain't gotta find out, Dave," he said gently. "We're in this together no matter what, okay?" He would see him through this, even if it meant moving mountains. As they sat in the quiet coffee shop, the low hum of the espresso machine the only sound, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. Whatever was coming, he'd stand by David's side, like a brother, offering support and friendship when he needed it most. The road ahead would be a bitch, but they'd face it together, come hell or high water. David took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling like it was a fight. I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice shaking. "This whole thing is overwhelming." Michael nodded, his grip tightening slightly. "Take it slow, Dave," he said softly. "There's no rush. Tell me what you need and we'll figure it out together, okay?" He wasn't going to let David feel lost. David looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and pain. "I know, man," he said softly. I don't know what I'd do without you, honestly." He was honest with how scared he was. Michael smiled, his heart aching for his friend. "You won't have to find out, Dave," he said gently. "We'll face this together, no matter what." He was truly grateful for their friendship. As they sat in the quiet coffee shop, the espresso machine humming softly, Michael couldn't help but feel determined. No matter what, he'd be right by David's side, lending a hand, an ear, whatever. The road ahead was gonna be rough, but they'd make it through side by side, no question. The conference room felt sterile, the air thick with a tension that made you want to hold your breath. Michael stood by the large mahogany table as David introduced him to Mr. Thompson, a man in his mid-50s whose crisp suit and calm demeanor suggested a lifetime spent navigating high-stakes situations. The late afternoon sun streamed in through the tall windows, casting long, dramatic shadows that danced across the polished wood floor. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioning, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the two friends. "Good to meet you, Mr. Thompson," Michael said, extending his hand. Mr. Thompson's grip was firm and brief, his handshake a mixture of confidence and professional courtesy. Michael sized him up. A guy who didn't waste words. They took their seats, the leather chairs creaking slightly under their weight. Mr. Thompson placed his briefcase on the table, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. He opened it, pulling out a thick folder and setting it on the table. The sound was like a starting gun for a very serious game. "Let's clarify the current situation, David." Mr. Thompson began, his voice measured and calm. "Have there been any further developments in your discussions with your wife?" David hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap, a stark contrast to his usual easygoing demeanor. "Yeah, she's lawyered up, hired some old family friend of hers." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the weight he was carrying. Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression thoughtful, a hint of a frown creasing his brow. "I see. Well then, let's formulate a strategy. First, regarding the division of assets." He opened the folder, the rustling of paper filling the air. "We must ensure that your financial interests are fully protected during this process." For the next hour, the three men meticulously went through the legal details of the impending divorce, alimony, property division, financial planning, a process that felt like slowly dissecting a complex organism. Mr. Thompson spoke with a dispassionate calm, his advice both practical and aimed at safeguarding David's future. He was like a seasoned captain guiding a ship through a treacherous storm. Michael watched, a silent observer, acutely aware of the weight of the situation. "David," Mr. Thompson said, his tone firm but not unkind, "it's completely understandable that you're feeling a lot of emotional turmoil. But you need to maintain a composed demeanor during the upcoming negotiations. Do not engage in any inflammatory discussions or allow yourself to be drawn into an emotional argument." He locked eyes with David, his gaze a mixture of empathy and resolute command. David sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping as if carrying an invisible burden. "I understand that, but when I'm face to face with her—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken pain heavy in the room. He rubbed his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "That's why we're here, Dave," Michael interjected quietly, his voice steady and firm. He gave David a reassuring nod. "You are not alone in this, you've got us." Mr. Thompson nodded in agreement, his eyes showing a mix of understanding and resolve. "Exactly. We're in your corner. We'll support you in every possible way." As the meeting was coming to a close, David's phone buzzed on the table, the vibration cutting through the tense silence. He looked at the screen, his face paling, his eyes widening with a mix of dread and anxiety. "It's her," he said, his voice strained. "You can answer it," Mr. Thompson encouraged calmly. "Keep your cool." His tone was even, like a steady hand on the wheel. David took a deep breath, a visible effort to steady himself, before answering the call. The conversation was short and strained, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. When he hung up, he looked up at them, his face pale, but his eyes filled with a grim determination. "Her lawyer has been in touch. They've scheduled the first mediation session for next Thursday." Mr. Thompson nodded, his face set with resolve. "All right, we'll go with that date then. We'll get all the final preparations made before then." As they left the conference room, Michael reached out, placing a firm hand on David's shoulder. "This is where things start to get real, Dave. We'll navigate this together. You've got my word." Michael's gaze was steady, his voice conveying unwavering support. David nodded, his expression a mix of fear and resilience. He looked tired, the weight of his situation clearly visible in the lines around his eyes. But a glimmer of hope flickered in his gaze, knowing he wasn't facing this alone. The hallway outside was quiet, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the polished floor. Michael walked in step with David, his presence a constant source of strength and comfort. The road ahead would be difficult, but together they would face it head-on. "Thanks, Mike," David said quietly, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you in all of this." Michael smiled, a small but sincere gesture of friendship. "You ain't gonna have to find out, Dave," he said gently. "We'll get through this together no matter what." As they walked down the hallway, the setting sun casting long shadows across the polished floor, Michael felt a surge of determination. Whatever lay ahead, he would be there for David. He wasn't just a colleague, he was his friend, and they'd get through this together no matter what. The mediation session kicked off with tension so thick it could have choked a rhino. David, Michael, and Mr. Thompson were on one side of the polished table. Facing them were David's wife, Sarah, and her lawyer, Miss Tanner, a woman in her early 40s whose calm exterior barely masked a sharp, observant intelligence. The harsh fluorescent lights of the room cast long, stark shadows, highlighting the strained expressions on everyone's faces. The air conditioning hummed, a lonely drone against the unspoken hostility. Mr. Thompson led off, his voice a steady, measured baritone. "Let's address the issue of alimony. We are seeking $50,000 as compensation for the significant emotional distress caused by the infidelity." His words were precise, leaving no room for argument. Sarah's face flushed red, her eyes flashing with anger, like a cornered animal. "That's ridiculous." Her voice was sharp, filled with raw emotion. Miss Tanner reached over, her hand gently but firmly pressing on Sarah's arm. "Easy, Sarah," she said softly, her voice a calming counterpoint to Sarah's outburst, but her eyes held a knowing glint. Mr. Thompson continued, his gaze unwavering. "This is not an unreasonable figure, given the profound emotional toll that David has endured." He held Sarah's gaze, not backing down. "Emotional distress?" Sarah scoffed, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You're just after my money. I've been lonely too, you know." Her voice trembled, revealing a deeper pain than just anger. David leaned forward, his hands clenching into fists, but Michael placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder to stay grounded. The room felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Then, unexpectedly, Miss Tanner spoke, her voice calm, almost reflective. "So, what do you plan to do?" Her question hung in the air, a sudden curveball. Everyone turned to her, caught off guard. Sarah stared at her lawyer, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice a bewildered whisper. Miss Tanner's gaze flickered towards Sarah, a mix of disappointment and something akin to sadness in her eyes. "They're simply quantifying the pain," she said evenly, "in a way you understand. As money. Or do you see some other avenue for making amends?" Her words were gentle but pointed, a direct challenge to Sarah's excuses. Sarah fell silent, her eyes widening, finally acknowledging the weight of her actions. The silence was heavy, filled with a raw truth that no one had dared to speak until now. "You're a terrible friend," Sarah finally whispered, her voice trembling, tears forming in her eyes. "For doing this to a friend and then turning on me." The words were a raw admission of her own betrayal, not just of David, but also of Miss Tanner. Miss Tanner's expression didn't shift, but a flicker of something akin to disappointment crossed her face. She took a small breath, her gaze meeting Sarah's with a hint of sadness. "The worst? No, Sarah. You're the one who's sunk low. And now I see what kind of friend you truly are." Her voice was low, but her words cut deep. Sarah stared at her, her face pale. The full weight of her choices seemed to settle upon her, like a heavy shroud. Miss Tanner's gaze flickered down for a brief moment, as if she were fighting something inside her, but then her eyes lifted to meet Sarah's with renewed resolve. "Take this to court, then," Miss Tanner stated, her voice firm. "Let everything come out. Let the world judge you." Her voice, calm and collected, sent a chill through the room. The room fell silent, the weight of Miss Tanner's words filling the space. The atmosphere shifted, the tension giving way to a strange sense of inevitability. Miss Tanner took a small, almost imperceptible breath, as if making a final decision. She glanced at David and then back to Sarah, her expression resolute. "I came here to evaluate the situation," she continued, her voice softer now, "to listen before I took on your case. But your attitude, it's clear you aren't ready for honesty." She paused, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "And I know what kind of person David is. I've known both of you for a long time." Sarah looked down, tears starting to fall silently. I understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. Truly." Her admission, though quiet, held a weight that resonated through the room. The air shifted, the tension easing, replaced by a sense of finality. The subsequent discussions progressed smoothly, and within a couple of hours they reached an agreement. Relief washed over the room, the weight of the past finally lifted. As they left the conference room, David turned to Michael, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't even process what just happened." Michael nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "Me neither. But that's a win, right?" His voice was calm, a source of grounding in the midst of the chaos. The hallway was quiet, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Michael walked beside David, his presence a steady comfort. They walked away, knowing that they had faced a storm and had come out of it. "Thank you, Michael," David said quietly, his voice filled with sincere gratitude. "I'm not sure what I would have done without you, man." Michael smiled, a genuine, warm smile of friendship. "You don't have to think about that," he said gently. "We'll always be in this together no matter what." As they walked away, the sun shining through the large windows, Michael felt a strong sense of determination. He would always be there for David, as he knew David would be for him, no matter what. A week later, Michael and David sat on a worn bench in a small park near their office, the sun sinking below the horizon, painting the city in a warm, golden glow. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant rumble of traffic. The park was a quiet little island in the middle of the city's chaos, a place where they could catch their breath. "It's really over, isn't it?" David muttered, staring out into the distance, his voice soft, a mix of relief and a little sadness. The weight of the last few weeks seemed to be lifting, like a heavy fog finally clearing. "Yeah," Michael said quietly, nodding in agreement. "You did good, Dave. You handled it all like a champ." His voice was gentle, a quiet source of strength. David sighed, a long, drawn-out breath that seemed to come from deep inside him. "I still can't get over what Miss Tanner did that day, man." His voice held a mixture of disbelief and genuine gratitude. Michael chuckled softly, breaking the silence like a crack in the ice. "Yeah, that was definitely unexpected. But you know what? I think that was the turning point, right there." His voice was calm, but held a note of satisfaction. "Totally," David said, his voice low but firm. Her words, I don't know. Something just clicked that day, like a light bulb went off. He finally turned towards Michael, his eyes now showing a newfound sense of resolve. Michael nodded thoughtfully, his gaze settling on David's face. Sometimes it takes harsh words to help people see the truth. His voice was gentle, but firm. David cracked a small smile, the first genuine one Michael had seen in a long time, like a break in the clouds after a long storm. "Mike, thank you, man. I don't think I could have gotten through all of this without you." His voice was raw with gratitude, an honest show of appreciation. "Hey now," Michael said, his voice firm but still warm. "It wasn't me, Dave. It was all you, all the way. I just helped you a little, is all." His voice was solid, a support that never faltered. They fell into a comfortable silence, the city lights beginning to twinkle around them as dusk settled in. The park was bathed in the warm orange glow of the setting sun, casting long, stretching shadows across the grass. The air was filled with the distant sounds of the city, a gentle reminder of the world outside this little oasis. "So, what's next?" Michael asked softly, turning to look at his friend, his eyes filled with concern and support. "What are you going to do?" David paused, his expression thoughtful, a hand absently running through his hair. "I'm thinking about making a change, maybe a new gig somewhere, you know? I need a fresh start, a clean slate." His voice was steadier now, like he had a plan in place. Michael nodded, his eyes showing his support. "Yeah, man, I get that. I'll miss you. But if that's what you need, I'm right behind you." His voice was firm, like an unbreakable bond. Tears welled in David's eyes, like a dam finally breaking. "Thank you, Mike," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The time I've spent with you will always be a lifelong treasure for me." His voice was full of heartfelt thanks, an acknowledgement of the depth of their friendship. Michael reached out, giving David a light pat on the shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "Hey, now let's not make it sound like we're saying goodbye forever. We're still gonna keep in touch." His voice was steady, like an anchor that never moves. David nodded, a real smile finally breaking through. "Yeah, absolutely. I will." His voice was full of a newfound strength, a clear indication of his resilience. As night started to fall, they stood up, walking side by side through the busy city. The air hummed with the energy of the night, the city lights brighter than ever. The park felt like a world away from the bustle around them. "How about a drink?" Michael suggested, his voice solid and encouraging. "Let's celebrate the start of this new chapter, huh?" David turned to him, his face brighter than it had been in weeks, a hopeful smile playing on his lips.
Yeah, let's do it.
His voice was full of determination, like he was ready for whatever came next. Michael watched his friend, a sense of pride washing over him. This whole thing had been one hell of a rough ride, but David had come out stronger, and that's what mattered. The future was uncertain, but together they had found their way through the darkness. This isn't the end, Michael thought, a quiet determination settling in his heart. It's a new beginning. His voice was silent, but firm, unwavering. Their figures slowly merged into the city night, their path ahead clear and their friendship strong. The air was filled with the hum of the city, a symphony of life and hope as they walked forward together into a new beginning.